And we're live on live Austro-Thomism live reading. I got Eincast, got Popular Liberty, Bulgakov. How you guys doing tonight?
I'm doing fine.
Howdy.
A little bit sick.
How are you, Caleb?
Doing good, doing good. I'm excited to read more Erik von Kuehnelt-Leddihn. I'm not going to try to pronounce the middle one. I spent the day listening. I spent the day listening to Liberty and Equality again because it's such a great book. And so I'm really
I need to read that book.
Dude,
that's
so
actually
good.
Probably the best. I'd actually be curious to see Contra Gentiles go through a
I have suggested it multiple times
because he is the closest to both the Thomist world, being in the Thomist world, and closest to the libertarian world, being closely associated with the Mises Institute. So he's the most palatable for both people to see the other side, I suppose.
I was talking to Grant. He wanted to. They were thinking about doing a Democracy to God to Fair, and I said it's good, but it's a lot of economics. You might like Liberty Equality more because it's similar but more reason based, philosophy based, and not a little less on the economics. I know you guys aren't a fan of. So who knows? If we're lucky, we can get Grant to read it.
Philosophy is how you convince Contra Gentiles, apparently.
It very much is. No surprise there. Philosophy should be how you convince most people. Yeah, philosophy should be how you convince most people, really. Making an economic argument is usually for the engineers, for the economic engineers of the world, people who see it that way.
I just make the emotional and financial argument now. I've learned too much that philosophy, this is not how I convince most people, sadly.
Yeah. I give up trying to convince people. I tell them what I think, and if they want to agree with me, neat. If they don't, I don't care enough.
I thought you were going to say if they don't agree with you, you're going to force them.
I mean, that's the eventual plan. But right now, I don't really have any power. I have to keep it down low. But let me say the screen here, and we'll get right into this. We're going to have Eincast do the reading again tonight because he did a great job last time. Where are we starting off again? I forgot to get on the right.
I think we're starting at 6. Where we left off last time.
There we go. Okay, 6 is up. Whenever you're ready, we'll hop right into it.
Sounds good. And again, if we need to jump in for comments, because I think this is gonna be a slightly longer reading than the last time. Let me know if I need to break it up, if I need to stop. But otherwise, I'm just going to go until someone yells at me. All right. So again, this is Erik von Kuehnelt-Leddihn's Monarchy and War, picking up with chapter 6. A war between entire nations developing into an ideological crusade, the word crusade has near religious implications, was bound to assume total and totalitarian features. The totalitarians could kindle the fervor of their soldiers more easily because they operated in a highly authoritarian framework. This also explains why the German army fought well in the hopelessly defensive rear action for more than 2 years between 1942 and 1945. Yet the hate propaganda of the democracies was successful. Thus, mixed with racist motives, the United States decided to put the West Coast's entire foreign as well as American population of Japanese ancestry in concentration camps, a wartime tactic developed by the British during the Boer War. There were among them U.S. citizens with only one Japanese grandparent who looked Caucasian and spoke not a word of Japanese. Likewise, after the final mass surrender of German soldiers in May 1945, they were not treated as ordinary prisoners of war who were protected by the Hague Convention, but as DEF, disarmed enemy forces, and dealt with miserably. They were starved and ultimately suffered enormous losses, possibly as many as 1 million. Indignation about the German concentration camps, however, played only a minor role in this policy because the facts about German war atrocities were largely not believed. People remembered the lies spread about the Germans during World War I. Upon entering the age of the armed horde, wars inevitably took on new forms and another character. The idea was no longer to outmaneuver the enemy and merely to win battles, but, since this is a war between peoples and ideologies, to kill as many enemies as possible, whereby wars assumed an exterminatory character. The mercenaries of the past belonged to different nationalities and, once they signed up, could be employed for different reasons and operations by their employer, or even traded to one another. He who sells himself can also be sold to somebody else. Since wars had evolved from clashes between crowned heads to conflicts between masses of people, entire nations collectively became enemies of other nations. Therefore, wars could at long last be waged against civilians, not only against beleaguered cities, but against entire populations of men, women, and children. And, since technology had given us aviation, it had become possible to attack villages and cities in the hinterland of the enemy, rather than just attacking the enemy soldiers on the front lines. The French, pioneers in aviation, made a beginning in World War I by bombing a Corpus Christi procession in Karlsruhe and killing children, and the Germans followed up by dropping bombs from Zeppelins on British cities and firing artillery missiles on Paris from a distance of 80 miles. Frenchmen had to die, regardless of age and sex. This seemed all right. Europe had fallen that low. Curiously enough, it was the Third Reich, although planning aggressive wars, which desired to ban aerial warfare except on well-defined battlefronts. In 1935, the Germans, wanting a pact outlawing war on civilians in the hinterland, suggested this to Great Britain, which at that time had a Labour government. However, the offer was rejected on the ground that all efforts to humanize war would make wars more acceptable, and thus would be a blow to the noble cause of pacifism. Actually, all important British authors confirmed the thesis that in the Second World War, the aerial warfare started total war, war to the last extremity, willed and perfected by the democracies, not by the National Socialists. German attacks outside of the war zone were always retaliations. Some British authors merely shamefacedly admitted this fact. Others, Mr. Churchill above all, boasted of it. General J.F.C. Fuller stated that it was Mr. Churchill who lit the fuse which detonated a war of devastation and terrorization unrivaled since the invasion of the Seljuks. The war reached its all-time low with the destruction of Dresden, the German Florence, with a loss of 204,000 lives, and the annihilation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Although the Japanese had desperately asked for armistice conditions twice in 1945, in April through the Vatican, and in July via Moscow, the answer was only the infamous and idiotic unconditional surrender formula. The American people knew nothing about this, and during that period, not only did thousands of Japanese die in vain, but so too died innumerable American boys. The hatred generated by propaganda heated up the horizontal collective mentality to such a degree that the war in the Pacific assumed, in the words of American socialist leader Norman Thomas, the character of a military organized race riot. The racist aspect of that war achieved a very concrete expression in a memorable incident. An American soldier sent President Roosevelt a paper knife made from the thigh bone of a Japanese soldier killed in action. The president wrote him a letter of thanks and expressed his hope to get more such presents. The news reached the Japanese, whereupon Ken Harada, Japanese ambassador at the Vatican, decided to protest via Roman channels. The president then changed his mind and promised to give the knife a dignified burial. An even greater evidence of sheer barbarism appeared in the bombing of the Gestapo center in The Hague, leaving 800 Dutch dead. Even worse were the 3,500 victims of the carpet bombing of Le Havre, just prior to his liberation, but after the evacuation by the Germans. De Gaulle was outraged, but German-American allies justified themselves by saying, "We really thought that the Jerrys were still in the city." Thereupon, de Gaulle hit the ceiling, butchering 3,500 Frenchmen just to get a few Germans. He went to Le Havre for their burial, heading the cortege with the clergy. Nor was there any respect for the cultural treasures of the old world. In World War I, the Germans were accused of shelling Reims Cathedral, with the excuse that observers were hidden in the spire, and having willfully burnt down parts of Louvain-Leuven before civilians had fired on their troops. But World War II was far more progressive, which means that Europe and North America had declined for the previous 200 years under populist rule, and had reached the cultural and ethical levels of Dahome's Geigle or Uganda's Idi Amin Dada. The raids over Germany were called Baedeker raids because, fearing for their safety, the Allied pilots flew very high and emptied their freight more or less in the historic centers of the cities, destroying the most beautiful buildings, but damaging industrial war production astonishingly little. The hearts of Frankfurt, Munich, Nuremberg, Hamburg, and Bremen were in shambles, but the industrial establishments surrounding them survived. Some Allied spokesmen explained that one wanted to hit the workers' dwellings, while others thought that the annihilating German Kultur destroyed Nazi arrogance. Yet that blood orgy contributed little to the Allied victory. IG Farben and other big enterprises functioned to the bitter end. One of the worst and most idiotic feats was the U.S. Army's destruction of the ancient Italian monastery of Monte Cassino. The Allies had been informed that there were no German troops inside, but since the building remained intact, a hue and cry was raised in the United States that to spare the monastery would be yielding to Roman Catholic interests at the cost of American lives. Our boys would have to die to please the Pope. Finally, the military yielded to bolster the home front. The Vox Populi should not be thwarted, and a political decision, not a military decision, was made. The old building went up in flames, thus making it safe for the Germans to occupy the ruins, whereas to defend a huge building under artillery fire would have been suicidal. Now the American soldiers faced an enemy much better entrenched and more fully protected by the rocks of the destroyed abbey. No falling walls could bury them. The Allied losses became much bigger, as did those of the poor betrayed Poles who had to fight with them, but public opinion was satisfied. The war was fought democratically. Yet, what did the American soldiers think of such irreparable losses of architectural beauty? An officer stationed near Benevento asked whether he had any misgivings, replied to an American journalist, "There's nothing what can be done about it. Italy is just lousy with clerical monuments." Most unfortunately, the Second World War had another fatal aspect. The resistance movement, enthusiastically applauded by the public of the Western Alliance. An exception has to be made for the Polish Armenia Krajowa, as well as for Jewish fighters, because the National Socialists, like the International Socialists, wanted to deprive them of their upper classes or to exterminate them altogether. With no legal armies for their defense, they had the moral right to fight for their very existence. Yet, as in other countries, the occupying army had no other means to combat these sly attackers but to take hostages and shoot them. Not completely democratized nations did not engage in such activities, and all too often, resistors were former collaborators who, sensing that the Third Reich was a sinking ship, changed sides. Obviously, the French resistance became truly active only after the collapse of the National-International Alliance. There had been a predecessor of the civilian resistance after France became a republic in 1870 in the form of the Franc-Tireurs, entirely in keeping with the rising horizontalism. One used to have no right to participate in a war without wearing the king's coat. The alternative was to sink to the level of savages. This was somewhat different in the case of the Balkans, where after 500 years of Turkish rule, the Christian tradition had been broken, and one went to war collectively, as we painfully experienced in 2 world wars. First with the nationalistic comitatus, then the ideological partisani. 7. One of the worst results of the democratization of wars was, and remains, the difficulty in terminating a war by peace, or at least by lengthy periods of peace. In a partially or fully democratic order, having fought with conscripted soldiers, one is governed largely by representatives of the people, who do not think historically, but politically. Of history, economics, cultural mentalities, and geography they know nothing. Moreover, they think personally, not dynastically. What do they have primarily in mind? The weal of their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, or the winning of the next election? Furthermore, the returning soldiers, if they have been fighting on the winning side, want to see the fruits of their suffering, so they yearn for a peace with maximum gains for their country. Mercenaries thought otherwise. They had their next job in mind. Moreover, generosity is a virtue more frequently found in the small top layers than among the masses. After all, it takes intelligence to suspect that generosity very often pays, while egotism does not. In a brilliant book, Fenelon exhorted the Dauphin, "Peace treaties are meaningless if you are the stronger one, and if you force your neighbor to sign a treaty to avoid greater evil. Then he signs in the same way as a person who surrenders his purse to a brigand who points his pistol at his throat." Yet, already in the 19th century, in which we witnessed the democratization of constitutional monarchies, we see that the warning of Fenelon was increasingly ignored. The German drive for unification and the Italian Risorgimento offered opportunities to annex entire countries and to make dynasties homeless. In this respect, the Italians made the start. The sovereigns of Modena, Parma, and Tuscany, and the Bourbons of both Sicilies had to quit. After the liberation of Schleswig-Holstein from the Danish rule by the German League, the legitimate heirs were not allowed to take over their inheritance. The situation was made worse by the outcome of the German-Prussian War of 1866, which ended with Prussia's incorporation not only of Schleswig-Holstein, but also of Hesse-Nassau, the imperial city of Frankfurt, and the Kingdom of Hanover. This was the policy of Bismarck, who had started his life as a typical Prussian conservative and devout Lutheran Christian, but became a German nationalist and a national liberal who, soon after the establishment of the German Empire, the Second Reich, initiated as a nationalistic progressivist the Kulturkampf against the Catholic Church. Yet the real break came with the end of World War I, which changed from a war between nations into an ideological crusade to make the world safe for democracy. By 1900, Europe had only 2 democratic republics, France and Switzerland, a form of government then represented largely by South and Central American nations enriched in 1910 and 1912 by Portugal and China. The great victory of democracy in Central Europe, even though its triumph in Russia lasted only 7 months, and the disappearance of the 3 emperors created a new scene. The Democrats expected to fashion the peace democratically, i.e. by the consent of the majority of the voters in the victorious nations. Of course, if we look at Wilson's 14 points, the defeated should have been expected the principle of self-determination to be applied even to them, but this lovely document had merely been bait for surrender. Since the victors were the democracies, the treaties were not treaties, but dictates, which had to please the voters at home. Since these had been taught to hate the enemy, the agitated masses in reality voted for, even if indirectly, the dictates. In Britain, we had the famous khaki election, an orgy of demagoguery in which Lloyd George promised to ruin the German middle class by way of exorbitant reparations, to make Germany pay so that the pips squeak, and to hang the Kaiser. George F. Kennan stated that nearly all our evils go back to the First World War, not to the fighting, but to the outcome. I offer 4 reasons for his thesis. American intervention, which artificially prolonged the war and prevented a compromised peace. The combination of national combat with an ideological crusade that aggravated the issue. The mountainous historical, geographic, economic, and psychological ignorance of the politician who naturally, thinking only of elections, wanted to please the voters, and the people's intellectual vacuum after their emotions had been whipped up to the nth degree. The bad taste of Bismarck, who organized the celebrations for the establishment of the Second Reich in Versailles, was now imitated by those who prepared the humiliation of the German Reich in the mirror hall of the same building. There, as in the far more important dictates of Saint-Germain-en-Laye and Trianon, were laid the foundations of the Third Reich and World War II, with the admirable foresight and loving care in every detail. The Versailles Treaty did tremendous harm in Germany internally, but hardly changed the map of Europe. The destruction of the Habsburg Empire made Germany the geopolitical winner of World War I. Bordering after 1919 on only one great power, France, it was now the direct or indirect neighbor in the East of partially artificial, partly militarily invincible states. As His Magnificence Ernst Kornemann, the rector of Breslau University, pointed out in 1926, the time to take advantage of this situation would come sooner or later. It came. Hitler inherited from the authors of the Paris and Bourbon treaties not only an internal situation characterized by the economic uprooting of the important social layers and the imposition of an unworkable form of government, but also a uniquely profitable geopolitical position, which was caused primarily by the division of Austria-Hungary. If Hitler had any sense of humor, he would have erected a colossal monument to Woodrow Wilson. Looking back at these happenings, John Maynard Keynes, who assisted Lloyd George at these conferences, wrote that the Carthaginian peace is not practically right and possible. The clock cannot be set back. Without setting up such strains in the European structure and letting loose such human and spiritual forces as pushing beyond frontiers and races will overwhelm not only you and your guarantees, but your institutions and the existing order of your society. One of these guarantees was the League of Nations, which Compton Mackenzie called a typist dream of the Holy Roman Empire, and which the Congress of the United States refused to join. Still, there is no doubt that general satisfaction reigned in the nations of the victors, not only among the Americans, British, French, and Italians, but also among the Czechs, Romanians, and Serbs. However, intelligent Poles, seeing their country buffeted between Germany and the Soviet Union, remained skeptical. Yet history, always immensely brutal, might have said to the defeated, since you were disloyal to your better self, to your heritage and traditions, you will serve not emperors, but exterminators in abject slavery, pitiless megalomaniacs who will force you back to another slaughter. And to the victors she would say, profiting from your huge superiority in men and wealth, you have abused your triumph and paid dearly not only with men, women, and children, but also with your worldwide prestige and possessions. Looking back to World War I, the old democratic enthusiasm for extending the great ideals of the French Revolution reappears, even at the price of enormous bloodshed, because democracy means to simple spirits freedom from rule from above or outside. When a compromised peace was in the offing, the democratic idealists went up in arms. The left hand of Wilson in foreign politics, George D. Herron, preferred even a Prussian victory to a compromised peace, which to him meant aristocracy, ruler barons, Habsburgs, and the Catholic Church, and would break God's heart, whereas even after a triumph of the Hohenzollerns, the nations still might awake after a long, baleful night to cosmic intimacy and infinite knowledge. Wilson greatly admired Herron, and made him his go-between in Europe during the war, thus giving him the opportunity to torpedo the Austrian peace effort in February 1918, for it would have meant the political survival of the Habsburgs. Yet, under conscription, the lives of soldiers are of little value, since they are easily replaced. The same holds true for the rebuff suffered by the secret German right before the outbreak of the Second World War, the Halder-Beck conspiracy, and then for the rebuff during the war of their efforts through Dr. Bell, the Bishop of Chichester, who begged in vain to get the cooperation of Winston Churchill. The Germans had to sign the treaty in Versailles because the hunger blockade worked like thumbscrews. The hope for a liberal democracy in Russia had been snuffed out by the radical social democrats, the so-called Bolsheviks, and thus Russia was no longer a fit partner in a league of honor, as Wilson had greeted the rule of Alexander Kerensky. 20 years later, the new Russia, the socialist fatherland, had the delightful chance to start the Second World War jointly with the National Socialists. Had the European monarchs ever tried to enforce monarchism in the Second or Third French Republic, in Brazil after the fall of the monarchy, or in Portugal in 1910? No, because there's no such thing as monarchism. Democracy, as democratism, is a Gnostic ideology hell-bent on saving the world. Monarchy is familistic. The family is something natural. It needs no philosophical impulses. It represents no secular religion. Yet, to make people happy, after one's own fashion, sometimes requires a little and occasionally even a lot of pressure. In February 1914, Mr. Wilson thought that the Mexicans would be much happier if, politically, they imitated the United States, which in turn had imitated France. This worried Sir Edward Grey, the British Foreign Minister. Between him and American Ambassador Walter Hines Page, a curious dialogue developed. The theme was Mexican reluctance to adopt a full-fledged democracy, which the United States, after all, had fostered and abetted in Mexico even before they had supported Benito Juarez, the murderer of Emperor Maximilian. The exchange of opinions went as follows. Gray: suppose you have to intervene, what then? Page: make them vote and live by their decisions. Gray: but suppose they will not so live. Page: we'll go in again and make them vote again. Gray: and keep this up for 200 years? Page: yes. The United States will be here for 200 years, and it can continue to hoot them for that little space till they learn to vote and rule themselves. With that unsophisticated mentality, the young democracies were forced to enjoy self-government, to rave about their new republican liberty. This wording reminds one of the Napoleonic conquerors of the Tyrol and the spirit in which the suburban Paris treaties were dictated. France had drowned Europe in blood in the 1795 to 1815 period. Yet, at the Congress of Vienna, its delegates were received with great honor. The sessions and discussions were conducted in French, and France left the conference table slightly enlarged. There was no cry to hang the emperor, nor was there a public whose craving for revenge had to be satisfied. 8. Of course, it would be naive to think that wars in the truly monarchical period of our Christian history were a pleasant pastime. Wars were not infrequent, and the discipline among the mercenaries was miserable. Occupied cities had to pay contributions, the taking of booty was accepted, and marauding soldiers were a plague. It was only in the 18th century that wars had assumed a civilian character. The fact that generals belonged to noble families helped greatly. They had the right upbringing, and Europe's aristocracy was internationally related, although not to the extent of the royal imperial families. In judging the character of their enemies, they certainly were never influenced by the mass media. One cannot imagine Marlborough being moved by the editorials in London's Daily Courant, as President Kennedy was by David Halberstam of the New York Times. The monarchs, however, were not only an international, but also an interracial breed, a great advantage to nations they ruled because it gave them a certain distance from their subjects whom they could thus judge more objectively. In 1909, the only genuinely native sovereign dynasties in Europe were the Petrović-Nagios in Montenegro and the Karađorđević in Serbia, certainly not the most significant or distinguished ones. The House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha ruled in Saxe-Coburg, Great Britain, Belgium, Portugal, and Bulgaria. The Holstein-Gottorps ruled in Russia, where the real Romanovs had died out with Peter II. The Bourbons ruled in Spain. The Alemannic Hohenzollerns ruled Prussia and Romania. The Nassaus ruled in the Netherlands and in Luxembourg. The Swiss-Lotharingian Habsburgs ruled in Austria-Hungary. The French Savoys ruled in Italy. And the Sonderburg-Glückburg-Austenburgs ruled in Denmark, Norway, and Greece. They all descended from Charlemagne and Muhammad, had a drop of Jewish blood, and from the motherline of Maria Theresia, they come from Cumanian Turk-Tartar princes. Excuse me. The Reformation raised a wall between the Catholic and Protestant families, but it was sometimes broken. Despite quarrels, wars, and denominational differences, even as late as 1870, the defeated Napoleon III dined as a prisoner with William I of Prussia and Bismarck in Wilhelmshohe Castle, where the Prussian king addressed the French emperor as Mon chéri, Monsieur Ferré. Self-control, good manners, and generosity belonged to a monarch. Here we have to keep in mind that although the interrelationship between the monarchs was tightened in the course of centuries, they were not entirely immune to the influence of the historic developments after 1789. In other words, to democracy, socialism, nationalism, and horizontalist temptations. It is even doubtful whether Lloyd George alone was responsible for not saving the lives of the Russian imperial family. In 1917, the British refused to give them asylum. Monarchy had several great advantages. First of all, one could expect a monarch to be psychologically and intellectually prepared for his task. Considering the intellectual preparations of some leading politicians for their task, we can only throw up our hands in horror, as often their looks and their gift of gab alone got them into office. A second asset is, or rather was, their international relationships and their lack of local ties. Number 3 is the fact that they owe their position to no party, faction, interest group, estate, or class, but only, to use the words of Bossuet, to the sweet process of nature. The fourth advantage is that monarchs had the chance to act historically. In democracies, where the primary task is to win elections, and where instability with nicely spaced changes is even a matter of pride, a constructive foreign policy is well nigh impossible. Monarchs were in office until they died, at which time they left their realms to their sons or nearest relatives. They could act historically, not politically, in a way without a time limit, hence their various political testaments. This has been aptly demonstrated by Professor Hans Hermann Hoppe in an essay which likens the democratic procedure to a small child wanting his wishes fulfilled immediately and protests in tears if there is a delay or a negative reaction. A monarch, as a member of a dynasty, can plan for a distant future, even for generations. Yet it would be most erroneous to believe that a return to monarchy, even a Christian monarchy, would solve all of our problems. Recall the praise of the great monarchist Charles Maurras bestowed on this form of government: le moindre mal, le possible du bien, the least evil, the possibility of something good. Still, a monarch as member of a dynasty can plan for the distant future, even for generations. In our times in which the globe has been transformed into an immensely complex scene, the abyss between the Skita and the Scindia, the actual knowledge of voters and candidates compared with the necessary knowledge, unavoidably widens all the time. And since the required knowledge among those active or passive in the democratic process is minute, only sentiments, sympathies, and antipathies, pleasing and unpleasant factors are now effective. Hence, democracies act like rabbits, jumping in all imaginable directions into unwanted wars, idealistic crusades, and undesirable, fatal peace arrangements. From childhood, monarchs prepared for their duties. They inherited the profession as traditionally as craftsmen did theirs. The son of a tailor became a tailor, and so forth. These tailors produced sometimes bad garments, occasionally excellent ones, but usually passable ones. So too with monarchs. Yet dentists, lawyers, cobblers, farmers, or plumbers could not have produced any clothes whatever, only monstrosities. Hence the decline of Europe, already lasting more than 200 years, which also means that one should not forget the already mentioned fact that monarchy compromised with democracy during the 19th century, and thus acquired merely a psychological role in the 20th. Wars, however, are undesirable under all circumstances. The ideal solution, at present a dream without any hope of realization, would be a board of Christian monarchs controlling the globe, aware of the fact that wars today, thanks to the developments of technology, chemistry, physics, and biology, have assumed a suicidal character. They menace the survival of all mankind, which, so far, has no common spiritual denominator. Neither has the UN, nor, really, the European Union. So far, the EU can only boast of a common economic desire to become more prosperous and a common defense against outside enemies, without any aggressive drive. Under these circumstances, its coat of arms should be a fat porcupine, a beast fairly safe in its natural surroundings, but not a valid symbol for Europe.
The porcupine.
That's a pretty good one.
The porcupine at the end. I don't know if that was intentional, but that's excellent, actually.
Yeah, that was that's pretty good. Andrew, you're muted.
I have to say that was a really good one. That made me chuckle.
Same. It's like all the libertarians have porcupines as their profile pic on Twitter or season right now.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Oncast, for reading. That was
excellent,
absolutely incredible. I'm always impressed with Leddihn. Like every I can read the same.
Mm-hmm.
I think I've listened to Monarchy and War, I think 4 times now, and every time I'm just blown away. I can't get enough of him. It's incredible.
He drives this point home with historical examples which feel a lot more real than Hoppe, who is very much an a priori rationalist guy. And then it's much easier to then, if you read Hoppe and then apply those principles to what you're reading in Leddihn, you're like, oh, I can now make sense of history. Instead of like having these free-floating principles that you can't apply or don't know how to because you don't know what to read historically. Leddihn sort of really fills that application gap because he already knows, he's already familiar with everything Hoppe knows, basically. He already agrees with all those basic economic and all of those basic economic principles of wars, private actors, private states, whatever. So he's sort of, and because of his historical knowledge, he just applies it. And it feels much more immediate than Hoppe's very brutal Teutonic style.
I feel like it's a narrative. That's why it's a lot easier to grasp. People grasp the truth of narratives a whole lot easier than they do the theory or facts.
Yeah,
and
that's why a lot. That's why like something like his Rothbard's historical essays, like in the progressive era, are a much easier read than Man, Economy, and State. You can read You can read 10 progressive eras in the time it takes to read one Man, Economy, and State. Because, oh man, I speak from experience here. Man, is that a tough read?
Man, Economy and States, like that's like a 1,000-page tome or something like that.
Yeah.
That thing's huge.
Even Human Action is easier to read despite being roughly
pages.
the same length. Because Mises will just break out, okay, this is the effects of the Industrial Revolution as an application to my principles, and so on and so forth. And he'll go out in these tangents. And Rothbard, being a very disciplined economist, will not allow himself to do so.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the point he brought up about how the Germans wanted to get basically civilized war a little bit with their treaties and we're dropping bombs and planes and that kind of stuff. And allies and not allies, Europe was kind of just like, no, that's bad. Right? We might civilize war. We have to make, we can't civilize war because that'd be like accepted as a norm. And it's like, you fucking...
boy, did they underestimate that.
I was fuming listening to that part. I was like, what the
fuck?
And
I've heard that idea a lot, actually. I think I've heard it many times, actually. The idea, look, we can't civilize war, else we'll make it desirable. I think even the great Robert E. Lee said something, it's good that war is so terrible or else it'd be so enjoyable or something like that. It's like, well, that hasn't really stopped wars and their horrors, has it?
Yeah.
Hasn't really decreased it.
No. Definitely has to increase that horizontalism, particularly when bombs flattening the place. What I really like about the narrative for this these past 3 chapters was that it really paints the death cult for what it is. And it's like, because he says like a few times, and he makes this point repeatedly, that like liberation precedes, I should say, like death or precedes the liberation. You're liberated and like, it's off with your head. And and he makes that point repeatedly that like they always come together. One might follow the other, and in no particular order, but they always come together. And and I really like what he's pointing out here is that just how utterly violent and senseless this high time preference is. And this is why I say democracy is definitionally uncivilized. It just means strength of the people. And it just it just means it's just a free-for-all brawl. No one is ruling. To rule means you apply rules and order, law and order. It doesn't mean that like someone's aggressing against you. It just means someone's giving rules, that allow people to have a sense of the natural order. And when you get into democracy, it's to hell in a handbasket, because now you can vote to basically take stuff away from other people. You can socialize property. I mean, so democracy is the pre-stage of it's the stage prior to socialism. And this is something that Vladimir Lenin actually pointed out in his book. I'm blanking on the name.
State and Revolution.
State and Revolution. There we go. Yeah, State and Revolution. He points out that we push democracy so that we can get to socialism, and because those two are on the same logical spectrum. And you see how very it's this high time preference that makes it so uncivilized, that because low time preference is what causes civilization. It causes deferral of gratification, in which compounding interest and building trust, building wealth, whereas high time preference consumes all of that and squanders it. And so you get from to where it used to be illegal and just evil to go to war. You had no right to go to war if you weren't wearing a uniform. And then it very quickly, after the French Revolution, it got to the point where you're not wearing a uniform. You have no idea, and you have no ability to tell who the enemy is or not. And because of that, it makes a lot more sense to just shoot civilians, because you can't tell. The enemy is not wearing a uniform, so you can't tell who's who. And this is why the British would wear red uniforms, is that they could tell who the enemy was and who the enemy wasn't. Whereas in the American Revolution, they weren't always wearing uniforms. Sometimes they were. They tried. They had some honor, whereas the French had none. And they weren't always. But the Americans weren't always wearing. They even if they weren't in a uniform, they were usually with people who were wearing uniforms, and were obviously gunned. Had guns, and they looked like soldiers. So you could still kind of tell that this is a soldier. And this is why the British didn't have to start just killing civilians, because that's, if you don't know who the enemy is, if you're in the Taliban, you might have to just start killing civilians, and that because you can't tell who the enemy is. And it's this democracy that naturally just uncivilizes people. I mean, it is an uncivilized mechanism. Yeah. And I'll make more points on that later, but you guys can comment.
I really the part when you brought up multiple times of how people would go through the Roman sandals to make chains. And it reminded me of how it used to be, the Catholic Church was the intermediary between the states. It was it was the first system of international law, and these people were trying to go back to the old ways when the other side was clearly trying to progress forward into something brand new. They rejected the old ways, and they kept the fact that they went through Roman sandals to try to for surrendering. The unconditional surrender policy prevented that. It's just absurd.
Exactly. And that they I mean, and you see with Churchill, he wanted the war.
Famously. Way before it started. I think he wanted it since 32 or something.
Yeah. I mean, the dude was fucked up by the First World War. And this guy, I mean, he was like a John McCain type character, where he was absolutely, just fucked in the head by war. I mean, it just absolutely screwed with his brain, and then he got a taste of power, and he just wanted to kind of relive his traumas.
Yeah, he actually fought in the Boer War as well. He didn't fight in this. Yeah, he was famously responsible for the Gallipoli disaster in the First World War, which is still a cause of resentment from the Australians to this day to British rule.
I really like the point about when you democratize, let me just mute my phone real quick. When war's democratized, it really decentralizes how to put this. It becomes a war on culture pretty much, because now it's a war against the ruling class, it's a war on the people. So the attacking of churches and monasteries, of the traditional cultural landmarks. Now it's a war on culture, and it's just it's so much more brutal in so many ways.
Well, it's kill the idea. That's why he mentions that. The difficulty, one of the worst results of democratization of wars was, and remains, the difficulty of terminating a war by peace, or at least a lengthy period of peace. This is because in democracy, you fight a war for ideology, and there's no killing a fucking idea.
Not only do you fight a war for ideology, but you fight a war between peoples. It's inherently exterminationist, because it's all these peoples against all those peoples. all the peoples are involved in the war in some way because it's democratic. It's all they're all soldiers in one, directly or indirectly, and so they're all to be regarded as enemy combatants.
Eincast, you guys need to add, or you resting your voice to read it?
I was trying to rest a little bit. I think it's interesting that they mentioned some of the bombing efforts, especially during the Second World War, where it's like, okay, they didn't want to take any flack, so just drop the bombs wherever. It doesn't matter if it's in the middle of the city or if it's actually hitting the targets. And this sort of idea of trying to, and we see it now in a lot of different ways in terms of economic sanctions, that sort of thing. Is okay. How do we need to punish the citizens for this war that we oppose? And it's this detachment from that. I think this comes in the footnotes. There's this very clear idea that the wars, sort of pre 1789, were wars between monarchs, and they would fund it themselves, and they would hire the mercenaries themselves, and the citizens would try to stay out of the way as much as possible. And with democratization, you have this idea. Okay, now it's because this is ultimately, we consider this the fault of the citizens. We know one really directly in a lot of cases blames the rulers in a democracy for the wars that they start. It becomes excusable to, okay, we need to inflict physical, mental, economic, emotional harm on the people, destroying their monuments, destroying their churches, nuking their cities, so that even if they are not directly responsible, they will rise up and overthrow their rulers.
Which is so ridiculous. How are the people going to rise up and overthrow the government? Come on. Yeah, it's like,
Well,
if you're fighting a war to overthrow the government and you can't do it, how the fuck are the people going to do it? Yeah. And but it's so much worse than that too, because he makes this point that the like these rulers who are doing this for political reasons, not for military reasons, because they want to get reelected. And if the boys start dying, that's going to cause a lot of hatred and going to really hurt the war effort. So he's naturally incentivized to let the planes fly a lot higher instead of a lot lower, where they can be shot at, so that his own people don't die. Even if they don't hit the target, and they end up hitting innocent civilians. And so the Democrats are actually incentivized to be more bloodthirsty in war, and to have an ideology that rationalizes this sort of behavior. There's all those people, they have bad ideas anyway, so they're bad people and they deserve to die. And it's a monstrous and you're painting all of these people as innocent people as just guilty of deserving of death for no reason. You see this thing in today, like with the Muslims in Afghanistan. The vast majority of these people are just not terrorists; they just don't want to be involved. And very few of them are like the Taliban or Al Qaeda. And so, but all the same, we drone bombed a house and we killed a bunch of children. Oh well, and
at least they weren't voters, right?
Yeah, at least they're not our voters. Exactly. And it's just this absolute, and it's like they train their actual voters to hate the enemy. He mentions this here, where he says, hey, since these people had been taught to hate the enemy, the agitated masses in reality voted for, even if indirectly, these dictates that what the treaties supposedly actually were. And in Britain, we had the famous khaki election, an orgy of demagoguery, in which Lloyd George promised to ruin the German middle class. It ran on ruining their middle class, not the Kaiser, not Hitler, the middle class. What the fuck?
That's such an insane statement.
It's like, by the way, this is the same exact reason they hate capitalism, because that's a monarchy as well. It's like they train their people to always hate anyone who could possibly oppose them, who thinks differently than them. And this is the sort of thing that they do is in order to maintain their power, is they always keep that hatred going in a different direction. I mean, this is and to the point, like, they do not care about killing innocent people. That's why I say it's so ironic when they're the ones saying that, we should hang the Kaiser. And really they're the ones who should be hung. It's funny because they're like, and what did this cause? Like back then they were like, oh, the Kaiser is the most evil man in the world. He's basically Hitler. And they're like, who's Hitler? It's like, we didn't get that guy yet. We got Hitler because of the republic they created after they got rid of the monarch.
I think Eric doesn't really get Leddihn doesn't really quite get into this, but something I think is interesting is he mentioned, I think what we read last time, he talked a lot about the propaganda and being able to demonize and dehumanize the enemy. But I think something that you also that's sort of necessary for that is there needs to be suffering of the native people. Like, what you see a lot in a lot of modern American conflicts is people are dying overseas, and it's not that we necessarily hate them. It's just a lot of Americans just don't care. And I think it's when we start seeing American suffering, usually because of the actions of our own government, that you're going to start seeing that serious hatred for the other. I think you see that a lot, certainly in World War I and in World War II, especially in the UK, and that's why they were so eager to enact their revenge on the Germans, because the British suffered so terribly under their own government, particularly in World War II. And I wonder about as the sort of American empire begins its decline. And as if things do get bad here, how much more effective does that propaganda become when people actually start to suffer? Because we've had, a generation now where we've been able to wage wars overseas, and you don't necessarily have to hate the enemy too much. You can just ignore that they're dying. I think that the hatred might get turned up as soon as there's a reason for it, even if it's misplaced. This is why
I want to really start taking over the education system with the GOP Mises Caucus. Is that we need to be pushing ideology like this in the schools, about monarchy and war, about, hey, this is the sort of thing that they do. And, like in places where you have home rule, is like, you need to be actively educating people on here's how they work. And, this is a monstrous ideology. Democracy is incredibly uncivilized. And yes, republics are democracies. And this is what they do. This is what they've always done. Again, look at Rome. They had, in their first 230 years, America's about 230 years old. In their first 230 years, they had 26 civil wars. That's just the civil wars. That doesn't count the external wars with other people that they had. I mean, this is a blood-soaked ideology. And so the people are not educated about it. They have this idea that liberation means peace. No, liberation is a death cult. It means death every time. The liberation is always preceded by lots of death. And it's like, this thing is death from beginning to end. And and the people are just, they don't know anything. They're not taught their history. Their history is hidden from them. I mean, you think the Protestants don't know their history. Imagine the regular people who just don't know anything.
There's a great line Leddihn has here, which he says, a democracy as democratism is a Gnostic ideology hell-bent on saving the world. I love that it's also, and it's, emphasizing that it is sort of a Christian heresy in a sense, because it's Gnostic. It's not only just Neoplatonic or whatever. It's specifically a Christian heresy.
Go ahead.
Sure. So I was in line with what Andrew was saying in terms of this being a death cult. I think we hear a lot about how socialism and communism are willing. There's no number of deaths that will not be that if they're in service to the revolution, they're okay. Leddihn mentions obviously famously the bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but I think in some ways even more horrifically in Dresden, which was just completely unnecessary, did nothing towards any kind of war aims. But there's this idea that, we killed 200,000 people. Some of them are our own soldiers, most of them civilians, none of them combatants really, or that hadn't surrendered. But it was worth it in service to this ideology. There's even for democracy, there's no number of casualties that are not acceptable if it can be claimed to be in service of this death cult of democracy. This reified democracy in the same way that the revolution of socialism doesn't matter how many people you kill if it moves towards it. Yeah, exactly.
And it's like, and you see this when they shout, like I noticed that he points out how the difference in temperament of the monarch versus the Democrat. and where he's like, you know, like when the Prussian king, you know, was meeting with you know, Napoleon III. You know, I mean, he was like, one of them is like really self-controlled, good manners, generosity. Like that's how a monarch, you know, behaves. Whereas the other guy is like death to the monarch or death to America, which, by the way, is why Iran is actually a republic. You know, it is it's not a monarchy. It's not a theocracy. It's a, you know, well,
it has too much democracy for its own good into the theocracy.
Yeah. I mean, technically, theocracy is always democracy. So, like,
yeah,
you know,
fair enough.
Because you know, who put those people in charge? You know, they're not monarchs. You know, they can't hand this thing down to their kids. So
on that point, when he brought up how monarchy is handed, the kingdom was handed down to the kids like a trade. It reminded me of I think it's, and I was reading Sirach. Sirach 10 talks about white justice of a king, and he literally talks and Sirach talks about trades, the trade going from like a artisan to another artisan to king, that kind of. Like, he literally uses the same exact example that's used in Sirach in the Monarchy and War piece, which I thought was really so in the Catholic side there. But one thing I really like about Monarchy and War, and really showing how what's worse war is under democracy and preferable under monarchy. Excuse me. There are a lot of libertarians whose litmus test is, are you anti-war? You know, that's a whole stick, is anti-war libertarians. And a lot of those same people are very opposed to ideas of like monarchy or Harper or Leddihn or that kind of stuff. And it's kind of ridiculous. It's like, if you guys were really focused on anti-war, you would be pushing for a much more attainable goal of democracy. I mean, of monarchy opposed to anarchy, and they're not. And it's
because they're not real like libertarians; they're liberationists. You know, it's like they don't believe in private property because they really want private property. They believe in it because they want freedom from authority. You know, that whereas, you know, a more right-wing libertarian believes in private property because he wants good authority. He wants legitimate authority. Yeah, and he's like, if you put Hoppe in front of them, if you put Yarvin in front of them, they're like, these guys make a ton of sense. I like what they have to say. If you put Hoppe in front or Yarvin in front of, you know, your liberationists, you know, that like left libertarians, they're just liberationists. It's like they start reading. They find all sorts of problems and they hate these people. They're like, what a bigot or something like that. And, you know, they find whatever excuse they can to just dismiss the guy for whatever reason, even if they don't care about that particular reason, because the real reason is that, you know, these are people who represent legitimate authority, and they don't want legitimate authority. They don't want any kind of authority. And that's why they're, you know, these are the kind of libertarians that I really try to seek out and like, you know, like push away, embarrass, block them. You know, I'm utterly hostile to these sorts of people because I believe in private property. You know, I'm with the GOP Mises Caucus because I want legitimate authority based on private property, which is what, you know, sanctioned by the natural law, according to, I think it was Pius the 12th, I think, who said, yeah, it's sanctioned by the natural law. And you know, as like all of the you know, the pre-Vatican II posts were really, really based, you know, when it came to that. But like you see, I like how Leddihn puts this right here, that Professor, you know, excuse me.
We are the most coughing podcast ever. It's like we are like COVID or something.
I know.
I've muted myself for every cough so far, but there's been quite a few, actually.
I need to be hovering over the mute button now. Professor Hans Hoppe, in an essay which likens the democratic procedure to a small child wanting his wishes fulfilled immediately and protests in tears if there is a delay or negative reaction. A monarch, as a member of a dynasty, can plan for the distant future, even for generations. And, you know, I put a comment right here that, you know, you actually have two extremes here, and these are not actually what you want. And this is why I like corporate statecraft as an idea much better, because it does balance these out somewhat. Whereas the, like democracy, you have, really high time preference consumption on one side, whereas on the other side, you have really, really, really low time preference. But most people are somewhere in the middle. So if you understand most people are somewhere in the middle, and democracy and monarchy both have you out on the extremes, this is going to be chaotic. This is going to be problematic. What you really need is something that has a little bit closer to a middle time preference that is slanted to the one side, to the one side being low time preference. And this is something that corporations actually do really, really well, where they'll make like 5-year plans basically, and they will budget for about 5 years in the future. And it's like not the best thing in the world. You kind of want it at generations, but this is a much better than what you have with democracy, of course, and is closer to the average person and what what the customers want, compared to a classical monarchy. And it's also can be much, much more aggressive about, proactively applying order and planning for it and getting rid of all of the causes of chaos, or proactively getting rid of perturbations of the natural order. And this is the, it's like, I really like, there's one word that I think is a comment that's really related to that concept, that he says, yet dentists, lawyers, cobblers, farmers, or plumbers could not have produced any clothes, where he's talking about, hey, like a clothes person, a tailor hands his trade craft down to his kid, just like the king does to his, just like the king does for his son. And if the tailor sometimes produce bad garments, but most of them get it pretty good, and some of them do fantastic work. Whereas if you try to have dentists and lawyers and cobblers and all that try to make clothes, they come out as abominations. And it's like, cool, now try statecraft. You know what I mean? It's like I mean that's his point right here, is that the it's like nobody it would say that, hey, let's all try to make clothes for ourselves. These are all going to come out awful, except for the people who actually know how to do it. And yet there's this idea in democracy that, every vote counts, or everyone, every opinion is just as valid as the next one.
Everyone matters,
and they all matter equally. And this pluralism and this bullshit like that. And it's like, of course not. It's like it's an obvious place where this should not be the case, and we don't do this anywhere else. And we assume, but it's just like taken as a given here that that this is the right and moral thing, that everyone should have an equal say in how statecraft should be made, but they have no clue how this thing is done. And this is like, and you would never do this in any other industry, any other service. It's not, well, except for religion. I have to point that out with the Protestants. Yeah, that is like, okay, and by the way, those two are related. Politics and religion are intrinsically related.
And I think to your point about, like, I mean, why should we not let market mechanisms dictate who is in charge of statecraft like we do for everything else? And also, you mentioning that sort of corporatism has this sort of nice middle ground in terms of time precedence, but because it responds to market incentives, it can raise or lower time preference in accordance with what the populace would like. Again, can it get to generational time frames? Maybe not, but whether or not a 5-year plan is appropriate, or a 1-year plan, or a 20-year plan is going to be dictated by the market.
Well, it's going to be dictated by the profit mechanism. Right. It's like that. That's the best, because you do have industries like the lumber industry, which, like, okay, that tree takes like 15, 20 years to grow. You got to plan for the future with that one. And you see this with like agriculture too. There are industries that do this, where they will plan years and years in advance, like many years in advance. And so the market is fully capable of doing this because of that profit mechanism. So whatever maximizes that kind of profit, excuse me, I missed the button again. But this is why, because of that, it's like, you do get something more of a middle preference with corporations, but it's slanted to the right, to towards low time preference because of that profit mechanism. It has to be produced. Profit has to be produced. Because it has a real existence, and you can't simply predate it, because you wouldn't have anything to predate. You have to, the profit has to be produced before someone can predate it. You know what I mean? And so this is something Rothbard talked about in Anatomy of the State. And so this is always going. So corporations always going to have closer to a middle preference that's slanted rightward and slanted towards low time preference. And how slanted that is depends on, what's the time scale of this. And so, a corporation, it may have a normal corporation might have a 5-year time span, but a state corporation might very well have a very long time span as well. That might be close to intergenerational. It might be, it's like very super generational, where they're planning like centuries in advance. That could easily be the case, but usually not. Usually it's going to be a little bit closer to the middle. Like even, and by the way, if our government were even planning 8 years in advance, that would still be a huge improvement. At least a fourfold improvement, because they're not even planning for they're planning 2 years in advance, but they're planning for the next election, not for the betterment of the people.
Well, that's what's so interesting to me is I would think sort of the highest you can get time preference in our current system would be 2 years. When's the next election? I swear it's gotten shorter. I really think that watching the way that the U.S. is being governed right now, that no one is even thinking to November right now, because if they would,
feels month to month, at least on Twitter.
Unless there is some larger plan, if these people are planning on being reelected, they're really bad at it. They sort of will realize some point over the summer, oh yeah, we need to start getting out messaging so we can get reelected.
Trust the plan, man. Trust the plan.
They have been working for 2 years towards re-elections. Their time preference is even
Trump
higher than that.
The shadows planning for the next 20 elections.
I like Time Magazine Part 2: How We Fortified This Election.
Right. Yeah.
It's at this point, I say okay, they're definitely not planning for the future at all. They're just reacting at this point. This is pure action reaction right now, and this is not planning for the future at all. And so, it's I have to think these people have got to be smarter than that. They planning.
So I think that this is one of the things I love about going off topic a little bit. But Hayek's Road to Serfdom is this idea of why the worst end up at the top is that you have incentivized the kind of people that have incredibly high time preference, the kind of people that could get to their primary, they could get to they can get to next month in as most devious and advantageous manner as possible, and that don't think more than a week or a month ahead. Whatever the highest time preference that can survive is the one that's going to end up thriving. And so what you see is leadership has just become entirely that kind of individual who can't even look to the next election. Even
the one who's willing to squander the most social trust is the one who gets elected.
But also because if the person who can plan 20 years in advance is not necessarily the person who can produce results in a year or fake results or whatever you want, so they're not going to get elected. Well, even if this is assuming that democracy is results-based here, which is a very kind and generous assumption on my part, but still, for the sake of argument, it still sort of completely falls apart then, because the person who can plan ahead and deliver you a prosperous nation in 20 years' time might not be the person who can make you feel good in a year.
Well, it's the person who can, do it in 20 years and actually do a really, really fantastic job. It's private property. You know what I mean? It's these are the people with that kind of mindset. That's where that mindset goes. They don't go to the I always marvel at these businessmen who are oh, I'm a successful businessman. I'm going to get in there and I'm going to change the system. And it's there is no corporation on the planet that runs itself like the U.S. federal government. It's not just and I don't just mean like a ship of drunken sailors. What I mean is that it's a ship of drunken sailors that fight with each other at every single decision and undermine each other at every single decision. And there's nobody in charge. And it's there is no business that runs by simply fighting with itself, all day long and sniping at each other all day long. This is a business that would go out of business in a month. This would never exist. And so when a businessman is trying to get in there, and he's going to be flabbergasted. I can't believe anybody would do it. This is why we shouldn't run the government this way. That's exactly why, the reason why we have all of these businessmen coming in here to fix the system. It's exactly why we shouldn't run the government this way.
American democracy is a ship of drunken sailors headed by a senile captain with a drug addict for a son. Well, things are going well.
That's the real risk of monarchy, is that you could end up with a senile old man run by handlers and underlings as your ruler. God.
That is the worst case scenario for monarchy.
We've gone for an hour. Oh, go ahead.
And well, I was going to say, actually, the real worst case is you could get like a Joffrey Baratheon type sociopath reptile, like Kamala Harris in charge. Oh God,
I would say the same thing.
Too soon.
The same thing.
Too soon. Knock on wood. Don't jinx us.
Lord willing, we won't get her. It's weird. I like how to put this. The hope a president doesn't like die in office was weird for an anarchist, but I think a lot of anarchists are actually like are praying that Biden lives, and it's just a testament to how crazy the times are nowadays.
I hope Biden lives to see Roe v. Wade repealed. I hope we get our first.
do his Catholic heart proud. Yeah,
we have to. Yeah, well, I say we. I'm not American, but America has to have Roe v. Wade repealed with a nominally Catholic president. Well, I don't say. Well, not nominally. If he's baptized, then he is technically Catholic, and I hope he does repent. I do pray for his repentance for any private sins he has done, which are probably many.
He's a lowercase c Catholic.
Yeah. But I do pray he has at least a final moment before his death. He's safe between the saddle and the ground.
In his final moment of lucidity before the true senility kicks in. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, I hope so.
Boy, is that's a God, the chances are low.
The chances are low, but hey, dare we hope.
Well, we've gone for an hour. Anybody have anything else they want to say before I announce the next live reading we're doing?
Let me see. There's a few things that we could have gotten into Nagasaki that I brought up, such as I think few people know that St. Maximilian Kolbe he founded one of the churches that survived in Nagasaki after the bombing. If we got into that, I would have brought that up. But aside from that, which I was, bringing on, I think we talked briefly about Nagasaki, Hiroshima, and Dresden. So that was enough to touch on what Leddihn was talking about. So aside from that, I don't really have much.
And just to add on to that very briefly, and I think Leddihn does an excellent job sort of weaving in the religious subtext. As a Catholic, it's not overt, but it's there. And he mentions in a footnote about how Nagasaki was the cradle of the Catholic Church in Japan.
Yes, very much so.
That Wilson
the oldest Catholic church in Japan, Odan Catholic Church, is in Nagasaki, 3 miles from the ground zeros of the bomb.
And then with that Truman did a better job of wiping out Catholicism in Japan than 250 years of the emperor ever could.
Yeah, very true. Actually, very, very true.
Very true. Andrew, any final points?
Nope.
Okay, well, the next live reading we're going to do.
Actually, one final point. I do have one after all. He says, when he talked about the UN, neither has the UN nor really the European Union so far. The EU can only boast of economic desire to become more prosperous and a common defense against the outside enemies, but without any aggressive drive whatsoever. Like, this is definitely a reference to the LP. Oh, this is like one of the best references to the LP. It's like, a desire to become prosperous.
A vague desire.
One day we're going to spread that message. Yep.
Yeah.
Boy, timeless truth. Huh.
There were a few digs here. I feel like I don't know when this was written. I know he died in 99, I think it was.
So I was trying to find a date on it. It looks like this was published posthumously, though. The earliest thing I see anywhere is 2000, so just after his death. And for some context, I think this was a year before Democracy God That Failed. So
yeah, this might have been a talk. I have the impression it was, and then made to an essay for a book collection, I think.
That was about my God. But...
This was probably a talk a few years before he died, I think. Yeah. Which really speaks to the man's activity, being able to deliver one hell of a talk in his final years.
Apparently, he spoke like 12 languages or something, a whole bunch of languages.
He was a polyglot.
He spoke Japanese, and I need to make Erik von Kuehnelt-Leddihn like weeb memes, like him holding like a waifu pillow, and like make some weeb memes. I think that'd be a very funny way to like the Hopper weeb memes. We need to make the Hopper.
You're really gonna have to explain those to him in Paradise. He's not gonna be so pleased.
Also, we might need a VeggieTale form as well.
Oh yeah, I will contact Sam and ask him to make another one. Anyway, so the next live we were going to do. I have to find a PDF for this one because I don't have a physical copy, but it's going to be The Three Reformers by Jacques Maritain, Lucer, Descartes, and Rousseau. A reformer of religion, a reformer of philosophy, and a reformer of morality, and the connections between them. It's going to be this
You
is
mean
a
revolutionaries.
Yeah, he's very kind. We briefly talked
reform
about
is-
this in the
reform is too
GC.
kind.
Revolutionaries, reform is too
It's like,
kind.
why in the world do we call this a reform? It's much more like a usurpation or like a revolution. It's like calling it the French Reformation. It's like, okay, I suppose that's kind of accurate.
I made the point in the GC that we call it the French Revolution and not civilizational apocalypse. So hey, whatever. We're used to it. Why on terms?
Yeah, it's gonna
I
be
guess
a
we just
lot of fun.
start calling it the French Reformation from now. But yeah, Jacques Maritain.
Yeah, Marathon is fantastic. Just a brilliant early 20th century, I guess. I don't have his dates in front of me, but
early to mid, I think.
I noticed it. I know he's mentioned in Andrew's book he's reading right now.
Live reading. Very fun fact that I discovered recently. Do you know who Biden says is his favorite Catholic philosopher?
Who?
Maritain. No one else.
No way.
And I doubt he has read
Bullshit.
any Maritain. This is real. Someone has asked him this question. This is what he said. And I think Unheard had an article I don't think he has read any Maritain.
That cannot possibly be the case.
No, he just had to pick a name. He probably just guessed it.
You know why? I think I know why. Because in politics, Maritain was the closest thing to you can come to being really good and everything else in a shit lib, because he helped draft the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for the UN. So he's famous in secular circles for that. So I think that's why he must have picked him.
Okay, that makes more sense.
I know he's mentioned by Marcel. How do you say his last name?
Lefebvre.
Lefebvre. I know he's mentioned by I remember I got the book and I saw looking through the table of contents. And I saw Maritain. I'm like,
he's there all over the place.
It's weird. People I love don't disagree with each other. It's always weird to read two people. I like both of you guys. Reading Kaczynski and Land at the same time. It's but yeah, Jacques Martin's Degrees of Knowledge is incredible. And this book, I'm only through the first couple chapters, but yeah, we're gonna have a lot of fun with this one.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
So, but anyway, go ahead. Ancath, give your plug. Let's have you go first. And again, thank you for reading.
Yeah, of course. Happy to do it. It's at Eincath on Twitter, AnarchoCatholic.substack.com. I'm trying to up the content. It's about one a month so far. And most of those things, if they're at all relevant to the content you've heard here, get cross-posted to what is now actually Austro-Thomism.com, if I'm not mistaken. We have the URL secure thanks to Caleb's undying efforts.
Oh, wow.
Well, I have secured the URL, but the website will not how do I put this? I go to all the steps, and it gets to the last step. We'll go, okay, publishing the website, and then it's stuck on that page for 24 hours and won't move past it. And so I have
at some point we'll be at Austro-Thomism.
It's probably gonna be another week before the website is up again.
It wouldn't be Austro-Thomism without technical difficulties. I think we can all admit that. It'd be something else.
I'm probably gonna have to hire a dude, honestly. I'm tired of dealing with it. Andrew, what are your plugs? Where can people find you at?
You can find me at Popular Liberty _ on Twitter, where you can see me dunking on Protestants and shit libs all over the place. And you can also find me at Popular Liberty on YouTube, where I'm going to be posting chapter 6 of They Have Uncrowned Him by Marcel Lefebvre tomorrow. It's about a 2-hour discussion with my good friend and co-host LB Muniz, and where the subject is going to be the necessity of inequality. And we're also going to be able to dunk on libertarians at the same exact time, because their liberty and equality are two sides of the same coin, in terms of errors that they both presume to be I'm born this way. That's why you can't touch me. I'm born free and I'm born equal. It's nope. And so I'm going to be posting that tomorrow. And if you also want to help out at the GOP Mises Caucus, where I think we have. Do we have an Austro-Thomism? I'm pretty sure we have an Austro-Thomism link. I'm pretty sure I gave you one, Caleb.
I think you gave me one. I think you gave me one for Faith, Liberty, and Praxis, but not for Austro-Thomism. I still haven't said the Faith, Liberty, and Praxis one.
All right. Well, I will. Okay. Well, I'll add a link for that. But for now, just misesgop.org/donate. And again, we can probably get back to corporate statecraft and monarchy fairly quickly. I think this is actually going to be a much cheaper, better, faster solution to getting to real liberty for the people who actually want it. Not all libertarians do. They're just anti-authority, as we discussed.
Welcome. What are your plugs?
Sure. It's just the @ you can see here on the video @ available username. Bulgakov's Behemoth is my tag. I don't know. I write for Austro-Thomism. I'm trying to come up with an article this weekend. Already have the idea. It's about the science TM and subversion of like folk norms, how we regard each other and how we interact. It's a concept I think Roger Scruton touched on it on Human Nature, but other writers such as Peter Giertz, scholastic philosopher of the 20th century, have touched on as well. So it'll probably be relatively short, but I'll try to condense Giertz and Scruton into it. So that's what I'll hopefully be finishing this weekend. But that's about it. I don't really post anywhere else outside from Twitter and Austro-Thomism.
Awesome. Well, you can find me on Twitter at CalebBrown549. Make sure you like, comment, share, subscribe. Go follow Austro-Thomism on Twitter. Side note for my show, we have Saturday. I'm having LB Muniz on for a episode on why most libertarians don't understand philosophy. So that's going to be a lot of fun. Yeah,
that's going to be a really short episode.
Yeah, I don't think it'll be hard. It's going to be a very fun one. But it's we'll talk about it after. I got a lot of cool notes for that one. But yeah, that's we got more stuff in the works. Website's gonna be back up soon. We got more live readings, more articles. We're gonna cover the next 5 proofs of existence of God soon. Then we're gonna go into some actual Austrian economics and do who's Mon's books on it again? It's
Mahidon's books. It's Rousseau, Locke, and Luther.
Ethics of Money Production by Guido.
Okay. I said who's.
We're gonna eventually cover that as a book club. With I think it was Anglo. We picked for that one. And
I
then,
need to read that one.
Yeah,
I haven't read any Hoostman aside from a few papers.
Oh, he's amazing. We focused
really
too much on Thomism for a little too long. We gotta actually incorporate the Austrian side of this.
Yeah, I gotta get outside. Okay, here's the ontology of being. Or whatever. Like, no, let's get into the Austro part for a little bit.
Exactly. But anyway, yeah, you guys, it's been a lot of fun. Thanks for coming on. Thanks for being a part of this whole program. I'm really enjoying the work we're putting out. So yeah, everyone have a good night.